Hello. I'm just gonna wait a little bit for people to come in because I know there are some people that really want to see this topic of Helen Keller. And I'm sorry if my voice sounds really strange, but I'm sick. But I also know how important this topic is, so I didn't want to delay it. But if you can't understand me, I'm sorry. I will put all the information that I gathered from the book that I read on Helen Keller in the comment section for anyone who wants to read that instead of actually listening to me speak. Or you could listen and read. I don't know how that works, but yeah. I'm just glad I get to do these live streams, even though I know they're hard for me to do because for me, since I have pronunciation issues on top of having having anxiety from reading out loud and everything, um, I'm proud of myself for being able to do this. And I'm glad that I get to talk to the community, be able to be there for the community that supports me, and be able to be interact with people that are like me because I've not really had that in my life because I don't know, I just haven't really had that. So I'm just happy that I get to do that. Hello to whoever just came in here. So I'm gonna get started. Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. I'm Mariah. Today's live stream is on the topic of Helen Keller. This topic is the first live stream for the famous women in the disability community live stream series for Women's History Month. The information below for this topic came from the book Helen Keller, A Photographic Story of a Life, DK Biography by Leslie Granite. Helen Keller was an author, disability advocate, and a political activist. On June 27, 1880, Helen Keller was born in Tuscumbia, Alabama. She was born to her parents, Kate Keller, a homemaker, and Captain Arthur Keller, a newspaper editor. She had two full siblings, Mildred and Philip, and she also had two half-siblings, James and William. In January 1882, Helen developed a high fever and lost her sight and hearing. The Kellers traveled from doctor to doctor with Helen over the next few years. None of them could help. Helen, trapped in a dark, silent world, became more and more frustrated. She often had temper tantrums during which she would kick and scream like a wild animal. Because of Helen's wild and uncomfortable behavior, some people, including some of Helen's relatives, thought the little girl belonged in an insane asylum. The future for Helen looked hopeless. But the Kellers, particularly Helen's mother, refused to give up. Helen depended on her mother and followed her around the house, holding onto Kate's skirts. Helen also adored her father and liked to imitate him reading the newspaper, mimicking the way she felt his hands holding it up and even putting on his glasses. Because she could neither hear people speak or see their mouths move, Helen did not learn language as a seeing, hearing child would. Instead, she used simple signs. A shake of the head meant no. A nod meant yes. For bread, she would imitate cutting and buttering of slices. For ice cream, she would shiver. If she wanted her mother, she would stroke her own cheek. Oh, hello. Before long, Helen developed more than 60 signs. Her mother especially came to understand Helen, and Helen to understand her. But even at such a young age, Helen realized that she was different. She noticed that other people talked with their mouths. She tried to talk also, moving her lips frantically, but no one could understand her speech. Helen became more frustrated. Trapped in her dark and silent world, Helen more and more often gave in to her howling fits of anger. In 1886, the Kellers met Alexander Graham Bell, who suggested they contact the Perkins Institution. Dr. Bell was an expert on teaching speech to the deaf. He invented the type of microphone and in 1876 the telephone. Helen and Dr. Bell became fast friends. Dr. Bell easily understood many of the signs that Helen had created for herself to communicate. Dr. Bell advised Helen's father to ask Michael Ianagas, I think is how you say his name, the director of the Perkins Institution, to send a teacher for Helen. Captain Keller made the request, and in the summer of 1886, a letter came. A teacher had been found, the Kellers read. The teacher was Anne Mansfield Sullivan, and she was born on April 14, 1866, in Feeding Hill, Massachusetts. Annie's eyesight was affected by an eye infection at the age of 3 and worsened throughout her time. On March 3rd, 1886, Anne arrived at Tuscumbia to begin teaching Helen. And this is a quote from Helen Keller that I thought was important to include because it was on the side notes, but in the book. So it said, "My birthday could never mean as much to me as the arrival of Anne Sullivan on March 3rd, 1887. That was my sole birthday." And for at least this is based on what I read, I gathered that for Helen, this meant so much more for her because, well, at least this day meant so much more for her because someone actually could finally understand her, and actually help her help her communicate with others in the way that she wasn't able to in the past. That's just my interpretation. I don't know that for a fact. That's what I think, though. And from now on, instead of her being called Anne, they refer to her as Annie, in the book, just to give you context for anyone that gets confused. Okay, so Annie realized that Helen's hands had been her eyes. They had taught her everything she knew. Now it was up to Annie to open up the world to her through her hands. Those hands, Annie knew, would set Helen's mind free. Oh wow. Sorry, sorry. I was reading what you said, but I looked down and saw what you said. Yeah, I can't imagine what it must have been like for her because she actually was born with her eyesight and her hearing, but she just lost it. Based on what I read, she lost it from what we now know is meningitis. Back then, they didn't know it. They didn't know what it was. They called it a brain fever. So she ended up losing her hearing. Helen Keller ended up losing her hearing at, I think it was either 19 months or 18 months. Because the reason her mom realized this, I didn't write it in the notes, but the reason her mom realized this was because they would have like a bell they ring when it's feeding time, and they noticed that Helen wasn't responding to that bell like she normally did, so they knew something was wrong. And then the second test, they found out that, the second reason that they found out, another reason they found out she lost her sight was because when they opened when you open a curtain, people can see, your eyes, you would like kind of make a face, and they realized there was no reaction from her, so that's how they realized that she didn't have her hearing or her sight anymore. Just to let you know. Where was I at? Okay, here we go. Annie started to teach Helen by finger spelling into Helen's palm, using the manual alphabet. Yeah, and that would be scary. I can't even imagine, especially because back in those days, back in the 1800s, we obviously know things were not like how they are today. Probably a lot of advancements that we have nowadays weren't around then. Um, okay, there we go. Okay, I don't know if I said this already, but I'm saying it again. Annie started to teach Helen by finger spelling into Helen's palm using the manual alphabet. Annie hoped that Helen would learn to connect the name of the object with the object itself. This was a challenging task for Helen to grasp at first. I can't even imagine what it would be like for someone to lose something they had in the beginning. I can't even imagine. But Helen Keller is very intriguing to me. All the stuff she's accomplished, well, all the stuff she accomplished for us, which you'll learn about as I keep going. Well, let's say a lot that she accomplished for the disability community, the deaf people that are deaf, people that are blind. Just she impacted a lot of things, political stuff. Like there's a lot that I knew, but I forgot about because I hadn't. Um, it had been a long time since I read the book because I read it, I think maybe in middle school to do a project on her. Because I think that was the person I picked. I think it was like a project of picking someone that is very impactful in society, if I remember. But that was a long time ago. Just saying. Okay, so on April 5th, 1887, Helen grasped the purpose of language at the water pump. And that was and this is the scene that they show if you ever seen the movie Miracle Worker, or the one that they made on her life called Miracle Worker. And they show a scene where Helen is like at the water pump and finally she gets all excited because she finally understands what Annie has been trying to teach her with the use of words and how the word and the object connect, and she finally got it and she gets all excited. And so, okay, and I'm going to go more into detail into that. Well, not that scene, but just the purpose of connecting words with objects. Just like hearing people, Helen learned words first and then had to learn to put the words together to communicate a thought or an idea. Helen was hungry for words, and Annie spelled constantly. Then Annie decided that Helen was ready for the next step. Annie pulled out a big card with 26 letters of the alphabet written in raised lettering. This was one of the ways that the blind learned to read. I was reading when I read this story about like her life and learning stuff that I didn't remember because I learned it a long time ago, and I think all that information kind of went out of my head because it's a lot to process. But relearning about her life is very intriguing, honestly. Okay, so in May of 1888, Helen and Annie visited Perkins for the first time. Perkins offered, and I'm sorry if you hear anything outside my window, but this house is not insulated very well. At least my room is not insulated very well, so I'm sorry. Perkins offered resources that the Kellers simply didn't have. They had raised print books, braille books, and more. In March of 1890, Sarah Fuller taught Helen to speak. And to me, that was intriguing because I forgot she did know how to speak some, even though you'll learn later a little bit or throughout this that her speech was not clear enough for people to understand. I even found a video about it because I was intrigued to hear how she sounded, because I just wanted to see, because I was kind of shocked when I read this. So when I read this in the book, I had to go look it up to see if what it must have been like. So the way Sarah Fuller began teaching her how to speak was by placing Helen's hand on her face and in her mouth. And to me, that was intriguing to read that. She lightly at first. This allowed Helen to fill the position of Fuller's tongue and lips when she made a sound. First, Helen learned to form sounds. With time, she uttered her first sentence. It is too warm. Though only Fuller and Anne Sullivan were able to understand what she was saying, they rejoiced just the same. And I thought that was really encouraging because it obviously we know how hard it must have been for Helen to even try to speak because she had never been able to hear it, and I mean, well, she never ever was able to hear speaking. Maybe when she was like a baby before she lost hearing and sight, but as an adult, I mean, as a little older kid, she didn't know what it was like. So to hear her even be able to utter the words probably was a shock to them. I don't know if they expected that much to happen. She worked hard to improve her speech. At the age of 12, Helen wrote about her own life in a children's magazine called the Youth Companion. In 1892, she learned about another deaf blind boy called Tommy Stringer. 5-year-old Tommy lived in a poorhouse and had no parents. The conditions were awful and he could not go to school. Helen decided to help Tommy. She wrote to all her friends and even newspapers asking for money to pay for Tommy to attend the Perkins Institution. Money poured in. It was enough to pay for Tommy's entire education. Helen was thrilled. She enjoyed helping Tommy and decided she would spend her life trying to help others. And to me, this showed at a young age for her, well, to me, at least personally for me, because I kind of relate to her, um, it showed her willingness to help some people that were, I would say, like looked past in society. That's just how I would phrase it, and show that they matter. So in 1894, Helen attended the Wright. I'm not sure if I'm going to say his name right. I'm so sorry for the person that I'm offending if I say the name wrong. I think it's Humason School for the Deaf in New York. The school's founders, John Wright and Dr. Thomas Humason, promised Helen that they would teach her to speak normally. That's why I was saying earlier that you're going to learn more about her speech because she was able to speak, but it wasn't clear enough for people to understand. Um, though she practiced a lot, Helen's speech was still hard to understand. She was disappointed that she wasn't improving more quickly. She desperately wanted to be able to speak clearly, and she was sure she could do more for others if only she could speak well enough to give speeches and be easily understood. Helen took singing lessons in hopes to improve her voice for speaking. The most valuable skill Helen picked up at the school was the ability to lip read. Deaf people usually take in information by watching the way people's lips move when they form words. Helen, who could not see the speaker, had to learn a different way. Again, she relied on her hands. One day, Helen and Annie set out for New York's Lower East Side to see the slums where many of the new immigrants lived. Helen could smell the poverty, the dirt, the rot, and the rats. This was an experience that moved her. Her already caring nature became even more sympathetic for those who had little or were afflicted by disease or disability. Though she counted many favorite, famous, and influential people as lifelong friends, what she really wanted was to help those who were poor, weak, and had little power to help themselves. Another dream was also taking shape in Helen's mind. She had wanted to go to college since she was a little girl. When she told Annie of her dream to go to Harvard University, her teacher thought it was impossible. And this is not, and I don't want you to think she didn't think she could do it. That's not the reason. I'm about to tell you the reason. Annie knew enough not to underestimate Helen. She simply said, not Harvard. That's a boys' school, because at the time, in the time that they lived, it was a boys' school, just to be clarified. Um, so Helen set her sights on Radford Radcliffe College, which was associated with Harvard, but created for women. And to me, it's insane that there were schools for men and schools for women back then. But we also know back then, back in the 1800s, they didn't have women's rights. Just to be clear, it came on later, but it didn't have. There was not, you know, many rights. Just to be clear. In 1896, she learned that her good friend and benefactor in Boston, John P. Spaulding, had died. And I'm just going to let you know, I don't want anyone to be traumatized by anything I'm saying. But there is going to be death talked about through this because, and the reason I put this in here is because it shows the strength she has, just to be clear, for her resilience to keep going even though she's grieving and through loss, just to clarify. And then in August of that same year, 1896, Helen received word that her father had died suddenly. Helen was devastated. My own dear, loving father, she wrote to a friend, how shall I ever bear it? Helen did find some comfort in her growing spirituality. She attended Radcliffe College. She was the only deaf, blind girl at the time when she attended college. And to me, that's significant because, and I, there's also, I'm going to say this, I didn't write this in my notes, but I know this because I read it. So throughout her time at that college, she had difficulties because, she couldn't see and speak and stuff. And I believe during her time there that, based on what I read, hi, Sai, based on her time there, she had experiences with, I believe based on what I read, that they thought that Annie was going to be a hindrance to her because, she relied on her a lot, but in that era, it wasn't. She was not. She was very helpful. Okay, so in 1901, Helen began writing her autobiography, The Story of My Life, and John Macy was hired to help her. John Macy is ends up marrying Anne Sullivan, just to let you know. Because I didn't write that in the notes, but I know that's what happened because I read it. Okay, so on June 1904, Helen graduates from Radcliffe with honors. And also, I forgot to say, Helen Keller's political views actually align with John Macy's, who ended up being Anne Sullivan's future husband. So John Macy was a socialist, and Helen loved to listen to him and discuss ideals, which partly at least matched her own, and would go on to be, like I said, to be Annie's husband. To Helen, socialism was about equality, peace, and education for all. And one thing I will say that I read, which kind of irritated me, is that people in like newspapers back then and like a lot of people underestimated Helen in saying that she shouldn't be in politics. She should just stick to helping the disabled community as if she couldn't have a mind of her own, which that really infuriated me because it made it seem like I'm not saying that helping the disability community isn't important. Of course, I believe that, but she does also have a mind of her own, and she is able to have her own, beliefs in politics and stuff. Where was I at? Oh, yes, there we go. Okay. Her friends insisted that Helen's politics had always been there. And the reason they said that is because of what I just said about how the newspaper is trying to say that she should just, like, she has no place in politics and all that stuff. That's why I had to put this in here. Where was I at? Okay. Oh, yeah. They pointed at her instinctive urge to champion for the cause of anyone in need, the poor, the oppressed, and the undereducated. Oh, and I'm sorry, I didn't read what you said. They didn't understand that Annie was a help. Yes, she was a help. People still don't understand. Yeah, that's true. You're right. They do need aides and interpreters, and I'm glad that things have changed since the time that Helen Keller was alive, and when she was being raised and stuff, because a lot of advances have happened. Where was I at? Oh, yes. It was during this time that Helen discovered that this would be her life's work. Campaigning, not champion, campaigning on the behalf of the blind. She learned that most blindness was a result of poverty, poor living conditions, lack of nutrition, and no access to proper medical care. And that's honestly, these three reasons that I mentioned are the reasons that Annie's eyesight got worse. Anne Sullivan, who was a teacher, who was teacher of Helen Keller, the reason her eyesight got worse was all from all of those three conditions. That I said, because she was born in a poor family. They didn't have the money to help her get the care that she needed, which resulted in her eyes getting worse and worse and worse over time, and eventually she had to lose one of her eyes, which is very unfortunate. I didn't put that in here. I know this because I read it. Um, and I just felt bad just to read all the stuff that she had to endure. Um, there were few schools for blind children and little training or jobs for blind adults. That made me sad to read that. She was an when I say she, I'm talking about Helen. Helen was active in the suffrage movement, which stood for equal rights, including voting rights for women. She also fought for fair pay and job security for workers. In February 1913, Helen and Annie developed a stage routine about Helen's life, beginning a 3-year tour of the United States. In April 1917, the U.S. entered World War I. Okay, and the reason I mentioned this is because Helen Keller was very active in helping the soldiers that were injured and helping them with all that stuff. I didn't write that in my notes, but I know because I read about it. She was very active in with the support of the troops and trying to be there for the ones that lost people and all that stuff. And if anyone, I got all this information from this book I read and I have. I will put the names of the book in the comment section along with the notes from this video, because I know not everyone is always able to understand me, because I'm not the best with my clarity probably, but that's another point. Okay, on February 24th, 1920, Helen and Annie's I think it's Vaudeville, sorry, or no, it's Vaudeville Act opened in New York. And this is, unfortunately, this is about to be another tragic event in Helen's life. So in Los Angeles, on the night of November 1921, Helen received word that her mother died. 2 hours later, she walked on stage and delivered a wonderful performance. She could divulge in her sorrow after the show, but she had told herself, and that's what she did. But she was comforted as when she faced loss Sorry, I think I said that wrong. My bad. Back that up and start that over. But she was comforted, as always, when she faced loss by her spiritual faith. Soon after, Helen and Annie returned home to Forest Hill. Helen learned her long life friend, Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, had died. It was another difficult loss, but again, Helen found comfort in the idea that she'd meet him in heaven. Um, she honestly, she went through a whole lot in her life, Helen. Um, in 1923, Helen began work for the American Foundation for the Blind. And then in 1936, Anne Sullivan died. And I think honestly, I'm not saying that all the other deaths were hard, but I have a feeling that this death was probably the hardest for her, because you know how in the beginning of this how I said that when she met Anne Sullivan, that was better than her birthday, because she called that her soul birthday. Basically, this is literally my opinion. Um, I view that all the stuff she gained from being around Annie Sullivan probably impacted her way more than her actual. I'm not saying that her being born is important. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying because all the stuff she gained from Annie, meeting her was probably the most important thing she ever did. And probably when she died, it probably devastated her to a point, even though I don't remember if they mentioned that in the book. They probably did. But just saying. I just think it's important to acknowledge that. In December of 1942, the U.S. entered World War II. And like I said, and then in 1943, Helen began her visits to to visit the wounded war veterans in hospitals. If I remember, I don't remember for a fact, but I believe I did. Like I said, I think she did the same thing in World War One too, but I can't remember if how it impacted. I know that her seeing probably the states of them probably was shocking. I can't even imagine. But I just think her life just makes me smile, because even like she didn't have the same stuff we had, of course. She didn't have um didn't have a lot of stuff we had, but the point is she was still a powerhouse. At least that's what I think. She and others in the disability community is probably the reason I can do what I can do. I'm able to do this because of the power they had. And if they could do that back in their time, even though I'm born in a different time than they were, I should be able to do it too. Yeah, I'm glad they did support each other, even though unfortunately they had to go through a lot in order to get to the point they got to. Unfortunately. And then in 1951, The Miracle Worker opened in Broadway. Um, and then the last point is in 1968, at the age of, I believe I think she was 80, late 80s. No, she was in her late 80s. Helen died in Westport, Connecticut. Honestly, reading about her life made me happy and sad, because all the hardships she went through, but she was a fighter, and that's something that I grasped through the 128 pages that I read. That she's a fighter and she continued to fight regardless of the circumstances she was under. And to me, um, honestly, I know my whole life I had to fight. Like I'm not trying to say from the movie. I'm literally serious. Like from a baby. Like so for her, same for her. She had to fight her entire life, like her whole life. So I wouldn't say we're not the same. Of course, I'm Mariah. She's Helen. She had her life probably was a lot more difficult than mine, and but she did make a lot. She made a lot of progress for the disability community. Um, and because of her and others like her, we're able to have the benefits that we have. Like, and even though unfortunately I know people have to still fight for their benefits and their accommodations, but she made some headway that we don't have to fight for like women's rights and like a lot of disability supports we have. We have to fight, but it's not the same fight she had to, to do, if that makes sense. Uh, and the next, anyone have anything they want to say before I say what the next live stream is on? And I hope you guys enjoyed this. I mean, for me, I was terrified about doing this because for research videos, it's a lot. I don't know. It's harder for me to do them because I noticed my pronunciation is not the greatest, but it's always not been the greatest. But I'm going to be Mariah, and that's it. I don't know. I just feel like Helen Keller was just she was a unique, very kind, strong, brave person. And I hope that people that learn about her understand that regardless of your life's hard, just keep trying because I think that's important. Well, I'm glad you learned more about her. And like I said, for anyone that needs these notes, I'll put them in the comment section. And also I'll put the name to the book if you want to purchase it or look it up or whatever you want to do with that. And the next live stream is going to be on Saturday, March 9th at noon EST. And it will be on the topic of Judy Human, which will be the second live stream for the famous women in the disability community live stream series for Women History Month. As always, thanks for watching. I love you guys. Bye.